Good to see you. If you're a clergy person in the Diocese of Leeds, you may recognise these tiles in this kitchen. I wonder if you've got the same colour. It's fascinating seeing people doing church from home. How many of us seem to have this shade of red? Anyway, it's good to welcome you. I'm doing a little bit of lockdown baking, and tonight we're looking at the book of Daniel. In the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not where it is in our scriptures. It's there just before Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles. That's where it sits chronologically. It's a bit confusing in the Old Testament where it's placed because it interrupts the prophets. We've had the big three. We've had Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and we're about to get the 12 minor prophets who together kind of represent the fourth of the latter prophets. But interrupting all of that is the book of Daniel, maybe because it covers a similar timescale to Ezekiel. Like Ezekiel, Daniel is one of the elite taken into exile. Ezekiel seems to have gone and then come back, but Daniel stays all the way through and actually lives a long time, spans about 80 years in Babylon. And so when he's thrown into the lions, he's actually an old man. It's a bit like throwing Desmond Tutu to the lions, an elder statesman, someone of that age and of that kind of reputation. Daniel covers a huge time period then. He's one of the elite that are first taken into exile. That's often how exile worked. You took the elite first and returned them last. You left the people without much education or much social standing behind in order to till the fields and to do that kind of stuff. But not so Daniel. He's one of the elite, and so off he goes. Daniel is a complicated book. Think of it in two sections. Section 1 to 6 are the narratives that we know well, and the rest of the book from chapter 7 onwards to chapter 12 is a series of visions, which are complex and difficult to understand. But what the whole book of Daniel is all about is how to live in a hostile environment, away from the land that God has given to his people. How will we live when we're in an enemy land, where our faith is not the dominant faith, where our God is not the native God? How will we live? What will we compromise? What will we hold fast to? And the book of Daniel is an exploration of that, written historically in that time in Babylon, or set in that time when the people of God are exiled, but actually a huge resource when the people are back in the land and yet are being oppressed by other regimes. So it's kind of like a resource that's used to work out how do we live when others are in charge of us, whether we're in a different country or in our own country. How do we live in hostility? And Daniel is known and prized amongst us who are Christians because it talks about much that is of relevance to us. There in chapter 7, there's this image of one like the Ancient of Days, the kingdom of the Ancient of Days being inaugurated by the Son of Man. And in Jesus, we see those two things coming together. And then in chapter 12, we read about the resurrection of the dead. It's one of the few places, Isaiah 26 is another place, where we get mention of the resurrection of the dead in the Old Testament. And because of this talk of visions, it's known as apocalyptic literature. We often think of apocalyptic as kind of like the end times, the end of the world. That's not quite how it's meant. It's more about ultimate reality breaking in, God's reality breaking in, which is why it can feel so disorientating, because everything's being turned upside down. Everything's being turned the right way up. And so what we get in this book of Daniel is this exploration of what does it mean to live in a place that's not yet quite the right way up, that in every sense is upside down. How do we make sense of this? How do we hold on to faith in the midst of this disorientating, confusing world where God seems to have abandoned us? Many of us will know the story of Daniel in the lion's den, but the real story of Daniel is how the lions are outside the den, and it's how to live in that kind of complex and indeed dangerous environment. But there's a key passage in chapter 3 where, because of their failure or their refusal to compromise, 3 of Daniel's mates, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are thrown into a fiery furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar, who represents really all of the people that oppose God's people, peers into the furnace And he's a little bit confused. And he said, how many people do we throw in there? And they said, 3, Gov. And he said, but I can see 4 walking around. There are 4 people in this furnace. And I mentioned Desmond Tutu earlier, and this is one of the passages I've heard him refer to several times, where he talks about that's the point. God is a God who is with us in the furnace, in the testing times. And what so many of these books that explore what it's like to live away from the promised land that God has given to his people find in the Psalms and in some of the prophets is that God actually shows up where his people are. Even though they're away from the land that he's given to them, God is there in the midst of them. And it's something profound as they deal with the consequences of their unfaithfulness, of having broken God's covenant with them. They find that God is still stretching out his hand in order to make new the covenant and is still with his people, even though they've been taken away into a foreign land. What they find is that in the heat, God is there. These cookies are ready as well. And what they find is that God doesn't desert his people, but stays with them and is faithful to his covenant promises, even when his people have been unfaithful. And as his people seek to work out what it means to live as aliens in a strange land, he is there reassuring them of his goodness, of his grace, and the promise of a new future, of a restored future, of his kingdom, the kingdom of the Ancient of Days, inaugurated by the Son of Man, an everlasting kingdom that will not be overcome or thwarted by any of these earthly rulers, but one which will endure. And it's in that promise, in that hope, that Daniel and his pals, as they come out of the fire, find hope and find resources to live for the future. And it's how the people of God down through the centuries before Jesus used Daniel in order to fuel their own hope. When the heat is on, when the fire is burning, in this book they find a huge resource of promises of deliverance and of hope. The book of Daniel. When the heat is on, God remains.